from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Tyler Kendall, I'm Michael Shepard.
Tonight, the White House ramping up the pressure for a bilateral summit between Russian President Putin and Ukrainian President Zelensky.
President Trump calling for the leaders to meet as he pushes for an end to the war in Ukraine, denying any potential role of the U.S. military in the conflict and laying out expectations for Zelensky when it comes to relinquishing territory to Russia. All that and more when we speak with former ambassador to Ukraine, William Taylor, up ahead.
Plus, the developing news from the White House when it comes to Intel. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick confirming a Bloomberg News scoop. The government is in talks to acquire an equity stake in the company. We'll have the market reaction coming up next.
And sleeping on the floor of the Texas legislature.
I am not free to leave. I've asked. In fact, they've locked the door. And they said I am not permitted to leave this floor tonight. So I am in for tonight. And I am not allowed to leave. My will is just as strong as theirs, and it's time that we stand up to the bullies.
That's the step a Democratic state lawmaker took in Texas in protest after refusing Republican demands for a law enforcement escort as the redistricting fight in the state escalates following the return of Democrats. But we begin tonight with the latest from the White House as we get word that the president not only called Vladimir Putin after yesterday's summit with President Zelensky, but also Hungary's Viktor Orban as well. The call between both men came at the behest of European leaders as Trump fielded questions on Ukraine's potential membership in the EU.
Meanwhile, we have new reporting tonight on Europe's push for a package of security guarantees for Ukraine as soon as this week as the leaders tries to seize on President Trump's backing. Joining us now with more is Bloomberg's Wendy Benjaminson, who joins us live from World Headquarters in New York. Wendy, people familiar with the matter tell us that this package of security guarantees could come together as soon as this week. What do we know about what's actually being discussed here in principle when it comes to this critical part of these negotiations?
Right, Tyler. So these security guarantees would be ways to prevent something like this from ever happening again. And while UK and French forces may indeed be on the ground in Ukraine if this all works out as a peacekeeping force, President Trump has said that there will be no American boots on the ground, but we could provide tactical support, logistic support, intelligence support, things like that. So, but that's, of course, if this all happens. I mean, Trump has said today that he set up this meeting between Putin and Zelensky, and the Kremlin's like, well, we're open to maybe talking, but you know, we don't know that we're not going to say it's going to happen yet. So it's all up in the air how all these pieces are going to come together, even as the White House presents it as a package wrapped up in a nice bow.
Wendy, we are seeing the European leaders who were with Trump yesterday here in Washington moving with speed to try to get something locked in on security guarantees. Are they trying to lock in President Donald Trump on this?
They probably are, Mike. That makes a lot of sense. You know, what's been really interesting about the last couple of days is to see how much different the approach is that the European leaders and Zelensky are taking to Donald Trump than at least the European leaders did in his first term. There is no, if you remember that famous picture of Angela Merkel wagging her finger at Trump in a famous photo of a G7 meeting, they flattered him. They came to the White House. They sat in chairs while he sat behind the Resolute desk. And Volodymyr Zelensky was very gracious, with Donald Trump. And in return, they got Donald Trump being nicer and more obliging to their ideas. So these are all things that could be in the works. And I think the security guarantees probably will happen. It's just a matter of getting Putin to the table and somehow in a face-to-face meeting with Putin and Zelensky, these two working out a peace deal, which may happen. It seems a little far-fetched as Russia continues to bomb Ukraine even today.
All right, Bloomberg's Wendy Benjaminson, we thank you so much, as always, for your coverage. And joining us now for more insight on what's next, when it comes to this ongoing conflict is William Taylor. He's the former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine and former charge d'affaires to Ukraine under the first Trump administration. Ambassador Taylor, thank you so much for being here. And I want to pick up on this conversation when it comes to the future of security guarantees, because we know today there was a gathering of European leaders and people familiar tell us here at Bloomberg News that they focused on a plan to send British and French troops to Ukraine as part of any potential peace deal. I would love to get your insight here on what is realistic to expect from the U.S. when it comes to security guarantees, and will it be enough to deter Vladimir Putin?
I think the answer to the last question, Tyler, is yes. But you asked, what could the Americans bring to this coalition of the willing that the French and the British are leading? But by the way, it's about 30 nations. So the coalition of the willing is pretty broad and has pretty much economic power and probably a fair amount of military power. But there are some things that the Americans can provide that most of the Europeans don't have. President Trump actually mentioned one of them. It's called air cover. U.S. Air Forces, air capabilities are massive. That could be brought to bear, and you don't need to have American boots on the ground, as they say. You don't need American soldiers or airmen on the ground to provide that kind of air support and air cover using the United States Air Force. They can fly out of Poland or fly out of Romania or fly out of Germany. Indeed, we've seen they can fly out of the United States. And so there's a lot that we can bring to bear, the Americans can bring to bear to contribute to the coalition of the willing that the Brits and the French are leading, that don't require, this stuff doesn't require boots on the ground.
Ambassador Taylor, another sensitive question in this, of course, is land. And following yesterday's multilateral meeting, German Chancellor Friedrich Merz discussed the possibility of Ukraine ceding territory as part of a peace deal. Let's have a quick listen.
The one aspect which has not been discussed today is that Ukraine should not be forced to cede any territories. Russia's demand that Kyiv give up Donbass region is comparable, to put it in perspective, to a proposal that the U.S. give up Florida.
Ambassador Taylor, we're hearing a different tune from Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin when it comes to land, at least from Friedrich Merz. But what advice would you give to Volodymyr Zelensky when it comes to this whole question of territory? Will he ultimately have to make some concessions, and would you recommend that? No, I would not recommend it, and he's not going to have to make them. Yeah, Putin wants that. And Putin probably put that in Donald Trump's ear in Anchorage last week. But President Trump just brought those ideas back. I don't think he's figured out yet what President Trump would recommend. But in terms of recommending to President Zelensky, no one needs to do that. President Zelensky knows exactly what he needs to do, and it's of a piece. It is perfectly consistent with what Ukrainians want. That is, they want the end of the war. They want this war to stop. They're tired. They've been fighting for 3.5 years. They've been fighting for 1,273 days, and they want it to end. But they do not want to give up territory. But there's a key distinction here. The Ukrainians grudgingly accept, Michael, that the Russians are in 19% of their country. And the Ukrainians grudgingly accept that the Ukrainians are not going to push the Russians out of that 19% militarily anytime soon. So even though they're not willing to give up territory and give up claim to that territory, legal claim to that territory, they are willing to acknowledge de facto that the Russians are there. And that's a big difference. And that's also, and President Zelensky is going to make exactly that point, I'm sure. And that's what the German Chancellor is talking about as well. The reason it wasn't talked about yesterday is because they're not going to tell Zelensky to give up territory. The Florida analogy is a good one. So that it wasn't talked about yesterday. Putin may want it, but the Europeans don't, the Ukrainians don't, and we shouldn't.
Well, something else that Ukraine wants, we know, is membership when it comes to the European Union, for example. And we had mentioned at the top of the show that President Trump held a phone call with Viktor Orban about why the Hungarian prime minister is trying to block Ukraine from joining that political and economic bloc as well. Do you see a viable path here for Ukraine when it comes to EU membership, if we know already allies have said that NATO membership, for example, is going to be off the table?
Well, first of all, NATO membership is not off the table. It may be off the table today, Tyler, but it's not off the table. I mean, you ask the Ukrainians, ask most Europeans if it's still viable, and they say yes, it should happen at some point. But there are some Europeans and there are some Americans who would say it's not on the table right now. So that's number one. On EU, that train is on the way. That ship is sailing. The Ukrainians are well on the way to the EU. And I'd be very interested to know what the conversation was between Trump and Orban. Orban has been a thorn in the side of the Ukrainians, but the EU is the right destination for Ukraine. They are ready to go there. They're working on it. There's a lot of work, as you all know very well, what it takes to get into the EU. But the Ukrainians know that, and they're working on it hard. And most Europeans, with the possible exception of the guy you're showing on the screen there, Mr. Orban, are fully supportive. The Ukrainians have a big stake, and the Europeans have a big stake. So I think that train is moving.
Mm-hmm. Ambassador Taylor, in the minute we have left, what do you see as happening in terms of this bilateral meeting between Vladimir Putin and Volodymyr Zelensky? Do you see it actually happening? Will Putin accept this idea? And is it a good idea for them to meet without, say, a third party as perhaps a chaperone?
On your first question, Michael, Putin doesn't want to end this war. Putin wants to drag it out. He wants to keep pounding the Ukrainians until they give up. They're never going to give up, but he's going to keep pounding until he's forced to come to the table for a ceasefire. So, no, I don't think he's eager. I don't think he has any intentions of coming to a bilateral meeting. He may say something on the phone to President Trump to tell President Trump that he's willing to do it. But all the official story coming out of Moscow is that they're going to up the level of their delegation to these talks. Right now, the delegation is very low. It's a deputy minister of culture. So they're not serious about these negotiations. And Putin is not either. Putin wants all of Ukraine, and he wants to pound them until he gets that.
William Taylor, former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, thank you. Coming up, we continue our conversation on the potential next steps for the war in Ukraine with Kurt Volker, former U.S. Special Representative for Ukraine. Negotiations in the first Trump administration up ahead. But first, how President Donald Trump's tariff policies impacting the global economy. We'll discuss that with Adam Posen of the Peterson Institute for International Economics next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
I think Chair Powell's in a tough spot going into Friday because we've got a long way to go until we have that September meeting. On top of that, he has the political pressure on the back of his neck he's been dealing with some time. So he can't lean one way or another.
I think what we're seeing is sort of the culmination of the consumer kind of settling in, rate stabilizing, and people realizing, hey, you know what? We may be very close to the bottom.
The big box retailers, home improvement stores, those that had the capability brought a lot of inventory, and going through that level of inventory has not yielded the pass-through to consumers that some have seen, but it'll come.
Some voices today on Bloomberg Surveillance discussing the temperamental state of the U.S. economy. Even after solid earnings from a major retailer, a rout in tech stocks dragged down gains across the indexes. For a closer look into where things stand, we turn to power moves with Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick, who joins us live from world headquarters in New York. Romaine, really, other than Intl and its gains on the day, we didn't see much love across the tech sector. What happened across the market?
No, tech was the big laggard, which is a rarity as of late these days. Of course, when you look at the big gains at this this market has made off of those April lows, and quite frankly, on a year-to-date basis, it has been all about big tech, and more importantly, it has been all about Nvidia. That stock has been on a tear, but a little bit of a pullback today. It was one of the biggest laggards in the market today, both in terms on a percentage basis, but more importantly, on its contribution to the market. And this comes ahead of its earnings report, which comes a week from tomorrow. Nvidia dropping below some of its key moving averages, particularly its short-term moving averages. And that's important because this is a stock that has been fueled not just by its corporate fundamentals, but by momentum in this market. And if the momentum turns, that could spell bad news for Nvidia. And more importantly, it could spell bad news for the broader market. But as you pointed out, not all tech was lower on the day. One of the few bright spots, and get this, Mike, Intl. In fact, Intl is actually the best performing stock in the S&P 500, not just today, but for the month of August so far. And this is a huge turnaround. Intel has been one of the biggest laggards in the tech space and one of the biggest laggards overall. A lot of concerns about its future, a lot of concerns about its CEO, but a big ratification of its strategy, and more importantly, a big ratification of its future when SoftBank, this is a behemoth fund run by Masayoshi's son, said that it would commit a $2 billion investment into the company. Some encouraging words also coming out of the Trump administration, including Howard Lutnick confirming the potential for an investment, a potential stake in that company by the United States government, all providing a big lift to the stock. You see the shares rallying more than 6% on the day.
Well, Romaine, as we heard at the top of the segment, traders are also getting ready ahead of Friday when Fed Chair Jerome Powell is going to give his annual remarks at the Kansas City Fed's annual economic symposium. What's been the Treasury market reaction leading up to this as we wait for any sort of clues about a September rate cut?
The reaction is they're cutting. You remember like in the old campaigns when everybody talk about drill, baby, drill. Well, it's cut, baby, cut right now in this market. Pretty much every trader out there right now is betting that the Fed will reduce interest rates at its meeting in mid-September and again before the year is out. Now, the Jackson Hole speech by Jay Powell on Friday is going to be key because this is really going to be his last big opportunity to communicate, if he chooses to, what the Fed might do next ahead of that September meeting. Now, there is a risk here. As we know, Jay Powell is not always forthcoming about what the Fed might do. He could go into that speech on Friday, ratify what the market has priced in, that yes, indeed, the Fed will cut rates. He could also throw cold water on that, citing some of the inflation data that shows inflation is still sticky. Or, Tyler, he might do what he normally does, and that's just dodge the question altogether.
All right. A lot to look out for. Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick, we thank you, as always, for your coverage and insight. Joining us now here in our Washington bureau for a bigger look at this, bigger look at the larger global economic impacts of, say, President Trump's tariffs, which we know are impacting how the Fed is informing its monetary policy, is Adam Posen. He's the president of the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Adam, thanks so much for being here. And I want to start just there. I want to zone in here on tariffs, including some big news that we got today with President Trump really stunning the logistics industry. He widened his steel and aluminum tariffs. It's expanded to now 400 consumer products. I'm talking about things like motorcycles and tableware. From your perspective, how does this demonstrate to us just how wide-reaching his tariff policies are when you think about these tariffs in particular being enacted under Section 232 on the basis of national security concerns?
Thank you, Tyler, for having me. And you're right. There is a bigger picture here. I mean, directly, this is going to contribute to inflation. It's going to make things more expensive for other businesses, more expensive for consumers. And if it doesn't get passed through fully to inflation, it'll draw down profits and margins for the companies. But the bigger picture is one of governance problems, both domestically and internationally, that the president has declared emergencies, and the emergencies don't necessarily tie to what the law says. I mean, there's no way that steel flatware is a national security issue. Even if 1 million Chinese picked up steel knives, it would still not be a national security issue, as the law reads. And so Congress has abdicated what should be a fundamentally congressional right to set tax policy and tariffs or taxes. And also, because he's doing it through emergency powers instead of congressional hearings, it's all very uncertain. So in the previous lead-up, you were talking about, your colleague Bostick was talking about Intl. You know, it shouldn't be a matter of day-to-day whether a president or a secretary of commerce says this is a good stock to buy, like he did about various companies, including Tesla at one point. It shouldn't be the U.S. government saying that. But finally, internationally, there is no end game here, because he's basically told a bunch of countries, not just China, that in the end, he'll set tariffs, whatever they're going to be. If you retaliate, we're going to escalate. And I can change them at any time. And so at that point, in a way that wasn't true under Trump 1 or under Biden, both of whom did do tariffs, I think other countries and investors start throwing up their hands.
Adam, we see the tariffs, and you just brought up Intl, too, as part of a larger piece of this Trump shift when it comes to the global economy. And that's something that you addressed in a foreign affairs piece out just this week. Can you talk about what the consequences are going to be of this rewriting of the global economic paradigm led by Donald Trump?
Thank you, Michael. I appreciate your mentioning that. We published, it came out today in Foreign Affairs, a piece called The New Economic Geography. I shouldn't say we, it's my responsibility, it's my piece. And the basic point is, when we focus very narrowly on tariffs or on bilateral trade balances, as the Trump administration does, you don't see the full picture. The full picture is that the U.S. was basically the insurance provider to global business, to foreign governments, even China, but especially our allies, in terms of shipping defense, in terms of getting money in and out of dollars, in terms of enforcing laws, in terms of intellectual property and standards, all these things. And the U.S. government collected premium for this. We had lower interest rates. We had more than our fair share of inward investment. We had more influence than other countries in setting standards. And the Trump people have decided that, no, we were getting ripped off. This was a bad deal, and we're just going to push hard. We're going to move from being an insurer to being an extractor. We're going to crunch down what coverage we offer. We're going to massively increase the premium, and we're just going to keep charging until we can't get any more out. And people like Secretary Bessent or others in the administration will say this is just a rebalancing. This is just, if they accept the insurance analogy, they're just repricing it. My view is, and we're already starting to see this, is people are going to choose to self-insure or go to other insurers, not rely on the U.S. when they're doing this. There are some countries like Japan or Mexico that have no choice. But even there, the households, the investors will change. And then other countries that do have a choice, like East Asia, parts of Europe, they're going to shift. And we're already seeing that in weaker dollar. We're already seeing that in higher interest rates on U.S. Treasuries. We're already seeing that in some of these investment decisions that countries are making. So you get the big ticket Intl announcement that you rightly reported on, but then you don't see all the things where China or Europe gets the opportunities in Indonesia or Turkey that the U.S. used to.
In just our final minute that we have left with you, I want to zone in on China, because this has, of course, been a really big focal point of the administration, as you've been outlining. So what is the #1 path here that the White House could take to remain competitive with China, but also make sure that there aren't these sort of consequences that you're outlining?
Well, the irony, Tyler, of what they're doing, in my view, is China's actually going to be the least harmed, the least affected, whereas it's our allies like Japan, UK, Mexico, Canada that are going to be worst hit. And so what I've argued in the past is you want, for want of a better term, a suction, not sanction approach with China. Instead of trying to keep them down, you try and make it attractive for things to leave China. Ideas, people, investment, and that puts pressure on the Chinese regime and it benefits us, instead of trying to bottle them up and making them mad at us.
Adam Posen, president of the Peterson Institute for International Economics, thank you. Coming up, a Texas Democrat opted to spend the night in the state legislature rather than allow a law enforcement officer to shadow her. We'll bring you the details in this latest development in the state's redistricting battle. But first, President Trump is hoping to finalize a Tri-Lateral meeting with Putin and Zelensky. We'll discuss that with Kurt Volker, former U.S. Special Representative for Ukraine negotiations in the first. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Alongside Tyler Kendall, I'm Mike Shepard. We'll have more on President Trump's effort to broker a peace deal between Russia and Ukraine coming up. But first, here are some of the other stories we're watching in today's Power Brief. Republican governors from Louisiana, Mississippi, Tennessee, West Virginia, South Carolina, and Ohio have all pledged to send 1,000 National Guard troops to patrol Washington, D.C. That's in addition to That's in addition to the 800 D.C. National Guard members already deployed in the nation's capital. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt discussed coordination of the troops earlier today.
This interagency team is meeting and talking daily. In fact, there's a meeting taking place right now in the West Wing with members of the interagency task force to continue to discuss not just the National Guard deployment, but also how we can continue to remove public safety threats off of the streets of Washington.
The surge comes despite Justice Department data released in January showing total violent crime in Washington is at a 30-year low.
Plus, President Trump plans to name Missouri Attorney General Andrew Bailey to serve as co-deputy director of the FBI. It's considered an unusual appointment that will place him at an equal rank as current FBI Deputy Director Dan Bongino. The news was first reported by Fox News and later confirmed by both Bongino and FBI Director Kash Patel on social media. Bongino is a former right-wing radio host who in recent weeks has publicly clashed with Attorney General Pam Bondi over the release of the Epstein files, leading to widespread speculation over his future tenure at the agency.
And visitors to the U.S. arriving on student visas plunged 28% in July. That's the biggest year-over-year monthly drop so far this year. The declines were most pronounced from Asia, the largest international education market, as the Trump administration's immigration policies created bottlenecks and uncertainty for students. U.S. universities have already warned that first-time foreign student enrollment on campuses is projected to fall by about 30% this fall, potentially costing the education sector $2.6 billion in tuition revenue.
And yesterday, European leaders gathered at the White House for a historic multilateral meeting. Here's some of what they had to say about their hopes to end the war in Ukraine.
We need to stop this war, to stop Russia, and we need support, American and European partners. And we will do our best for this.
If everything works out well today, we'll have a Tri-Lat, and I think there will be a reasonable chance of ending the war when we do that.
The coalition of willing countries, that's 30 countries already working together on security guarantees, will now work with the U.S. on those guarantees.
My hope is that the United States do the most possible, because that's what will allow us to alleviate the burden on Europe, and that the United States also confirm its commitments, because that was a big question mark.
Now for the latest on President Trump's effort to end the war in Ukraine. Following yesterday's impromptu White House summit, we turn to Bloomberg's Eric Martin, who joins us live here in our Washington bureau. Eric, it's good to see you. And in fact, we actually have already gotten some breaking news in the last few moments. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Dan Kane, tells Fox News he's going to meet with his European counterparts. This includes Germany, the UK, France, potentially a sign of movement here as the U.S. is trying to show progress towards getting some sort of deal over the finish line. And part of this conversation was a Bloomberg News scoop today that I know that you've been following. People familiar telling us that President Trump actually held a phone call with Viktor Orban, the Hungarian prime minister. What do we know about what President Trump is doing up to this point to try to get some more progress going to get Ukraine the sort of security guarantees that it's asking for?
That's right, Tyler. Absolutely fabulous scoop today from our colleagues Alex Wickham and Catherine Lucy. And just fascinating, right? This information coming out. First, we had yesterday the surprise. We started to hear about it and then confirmed it from the White House and from sources yesterday afternoon that Trump took this extraordinary break from his meeting with European leaders to go call Vladimir Putin, which a call that the Kremlin said lasted for 40 minutes. And now this information from this Bloomberg scoop that after the Putin call, he left and called Viktor Orban, one of his strongest allies in Europe, somebody who has been to Mar-a-Lago, somebody who in many ways served as the inspiration or the model, many people think, for the Make America Great Again, for the MAGA movement. He's been in office since 2010, so preceded Donald Trump by more than a half decade. And this is just fascinating. He is calling Viktor Orban and asking him about a request, a long-standing request from EU members for Orban to drop his opposition to Ukraine joining the European Union, to which we saw some response today from Orban saying that EU membership in and of itself would not provide any security guarantees. Of course, the EU is an economic union but doesn't have a shared army. NATO is the security alliance. But still fascinating that President Trump would take this step at the urging of his European counterparts to go and call Orban. Just extraordinary.
Bloomberg's Eric Martin, thank you. For more, we want to bring in Kurt Volker, former U.S. ambassador to NATO and former U.S. special representative for Ukraine negotiations in the first Trump administration. Ambassador, we're seeing some headlines roll in, courtesy of Fox, that military representatives from the U.S. and some European countries are going to be meeting to discuss further steps on these security guarantees. Based on your experience, what are the necessary ingredients and elements to ensure that these guarantees provide enough safety and security for Ukraine in the long run?
Well, there are just some very basic questions here. I think the key thing for the European leaders and President Trump to decide is what is the purpose of this force? What is the mission? I think that mission should be to help Ukraine develop sufficient defense capability that Putin is deterred from attacking again. So a deterrence through developing Ukrainian forces. That, I think, should be the mission. But there are other ways to slice that. One of them is to provide enough force themselves that they deter Putin. But if that's the case, you need to answer the question, well, what if Putin does attack? Do they then join a fight against Russia? So how do you do that? And then what is the role of the U.S. in this? Is the U.S. going to be on the ground with Europeans, or are we just going to provide enabling support like intelligence, access to satellites, logistics, maybe help with air defense, maybe help with air support if they're attacked? So there's just a lot of mission questions that need to be addressed. Once you get the mission down and you understand what the role is, then you can start talking about who contributes, what size force do you need, what are the components to that. And one of the things I would stress that's going to be on the European minds, whether it's on our chairman of the Joint Chiefs' mind or not, I don't know. But I know the Europeans will be wanting to make sure that whatever we do with Ukraine on security guarantees and assurances is going to mesh easily with what NATO already does. We don't want to create two different systems of security in Europe. So even if Ukraine's not a member, we want this to be seamless.
Right. And Ambassador, to build off of this, I'd love to get your thoughts on how we should be measuring progress here, because as you're outlining, there are a lot of different threads here that we could be watching. And we heard President Trump yesterday, for example, saying that he could be in favor of a ceasefire, but, for example, he doesn't think that at this point it's necessary. So when we are looking at the strategy here on trying to accomplish the end goal of ending the war, how should we be measuring progress towards that goal?
Right. It reminds me, if you ever see those videos on your social media of sheepdogs herding sheep, they run around this way and they bark, and then they run around the other way and they bark, and they just keep running around. And that's what it looks like President Trump is doing with Putin and Zelensky and the Europeans, is he's trying to get a negotiation going where everybody is doing the same thing, talking the same thing, and you end up with an outcome at some point. And I don't think he's particular about what that outcome is, but he really wants to get it so you have an end to the fighting, peace in Europe, and then you can get on with business again. I think that's what he's trying to do. So one day he's flattering Vladimir Putin. The next day he's in lockstep with our European allies. Then you're going to have a difficulty in finding a meeting venue. Putin's going to try to then roll up put in place roadblocks to actually meeting with Zelensky. More fighting's going to go on, and he's just going to President Trump is just going to keep trying to herd all of these sheep together.
Ambassador, what happens if President Trump is ultimately disappointed by Vladimir Putin here and Putin does not agree to a meeting? What happens then? We haven't heard the president talk as much lately of sanctions or consequences for Russia or its leader. Will that re-enter the conversation?
It's going to have to at some point. I saw Marco Rubio in the media over the weekend, and he was expressing the administration's view that if you impose sanctions now, that's going to drive Putin away and make a negotiated end to the war further out in time, 6, 9, 12 months. That is the exact opposite of saying last week that it was the threat of sanctions that brought Putin to the table. And indeed, I think the latter is correct. Putin responds to pressure. And when he doesn't feel any pressure, he plays games. So in this case, we're going to have to actually turn the screws on Russia's oil and gas revenue to get Putin to get serious about a ceasefire and about ending the war. And as far as the ceasefire goes, it was President Trump who originally said, we got to have a ceasefire now. And he convinced President Zelensky of Ukraine to go along with that, even though Russia occupies 20% of Ukrainian territory. Now that he ran into a stone wall with Putin, President Trump has flipped it and said, okay, let's not do a ceasefire. Let's do a full peace agreement. That's going to be very elusive as well. And I think later this year, and we're talking a few months from now, if we keep the pressure on Putin, we'll end up back where we were of just wanting to get a ceasefire in place.
Can we also, Ambassador, just get a more global scope here, the bigger picture when we are talking about foreign alliances? We had mentioned our Bloomberg News scoop with President Trump directly calling up Viktor Orban about potentially the future of Ukraine in the European Union. How are we seeing these alliances shift coming up to this week with now all these European leaders descending on Washington, trying to get some sort of progress made?
Right. Well, one of the good things about President Trump here is that he is completely tactical. So if the Europeans are coming to him and saying, we have a problem with Orban in doing what we need to do to back up Ukraine, well, Trump wants to end the war in Ukraine and he needs Europe to help. So he just goes and picks up the phone and talks to Orban and say, help out, help get Ukraine into the European Union. But I also saw that he offered that maybe Hungary could be the place where we host a trilateral meeting with Zelensky, Putin, and Trump. Well, that's not going to go over very well with the Ukrainians because Budapest is where we had that famous 1994 summit meeting where we agreed on the Budapest Memorandum to assure Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. And it was Russia and the United States and the UK. And of course, that agreement meant nothing once it was tested by Putin's first invasion of Ukraine.
All right. Kurt Volker, former U.S. ambassador to NATO and former U.S. special representative for Ukraine negotiations under the first Trump administration. We thank you so much for joining Bloomberg. And coming up, Texas Democrats were asked to sign what's being called a permission slip in order to leave the chamber floor last night after lawmakers fled the state to block a redistricting effort. We'll bring you those details and discuss that next with our political panel on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Those members present today for whom arrest warrants were issued on Friday should proceed to room 2W25 in the back hall to sign a written form acknowledging that you're being released into the custody of a designated DPS officer on the condition you'll return to the chamber at 10 a.m. on Wednesday. When we adjourn today, the doors to this chamber shall remain locked, and only those members with appropriate permission may leave.
That was Texas State House Speaker Dustin Burrows on the floor Monday upon the return of a group of Democrats who fled the state in protest of Republican redistricting efforts. Speaker Burrows said those Democrats could not leave the chamber unless they signed an agreement to allow 24-hour surveillance by Department of Public Safety officers. One Democrat refused to sign what she called a permission slip and opted to spend the night locked in the House chamber. Her colleagues responded to all of the news just a short time ago.
We knew what was ahead of us. What we didn't know is that we were going to be arrested en masse when he directed the sergeant-at-arms to lock the chambers and not let us exit. And then we were basically put up against the wall and said, not literally, but figuratively put up against the wall and said, no one's allowed to leave unless they basically sign a piece of paper consenting to moving custody, is what I call it. We are not criminals. We are statesmen and women. We are elected just like those people are.
Bloomberg's Joe Lovinger joins us now with the latest from Dallas. He covers all things Texas for us here at Bloomberg. Joe, it's good to see you and thanks for joining. Can you bring us up to speed here? How did we get to this point with lawmakers now sleeping in the chambers? Because it's our understanding that that lawmaker is actually still there, still hasn't left.
That's right. So thank you so much for having me. And we've had a really busy couple of weeks in the Texas legislature. So at the beginning of August, a group of Texas Democrats, a little over 50 of them, actually left the state. And they did that in order to deny what's called a quorum, and that made sure that no votes could be held in the Texas House. So they had been gone for about 2 weeks, and then they finally returned yesterday. But in order to ensure that they don't bolt again, House Speaker Burrows, as you showed, made them sign permission slips to allow Texas Department of Public Safety officers to track them 24/7 and make sure that they do not leave the state again. So as you can see on your screen, just this hour, we had 8 other legislators now come and tear up their permission slips, and they are planning on joining Representative Collier on the floor overnight again. She tweeted out photos last night with a sleep mask and a bonnet, and she told me earlier today she's planning on staying as long as it takes until that DPS coverage is removed.
Bloomberg's Joe Lovinger, thank you. Joining us now with their reaction to this story and more is this evening's political panel. Bloomberg Politics contributor and Democratic strategist Adam Hodge, managing director at Bully Pulpit International, alongside Republican strategist Brittany Martinez, executive director of Principles First. Brittany, I want to turn to you. Of course, this is escalating. Yeah. And is this the kind of look that Republicans will want, even as they are pursuing the potential gain of 5 seats in the House, where right now they have a very tight majority?
As I was watching that clip just now, the first thing that came to mind was this is a really bad look for Republicans. So, no, I don't think this is a good look for Republicans at all. And there was a point when they could have said this is a bad look on Democrats. They've left the state. They're keeping us from doing business. But now you are kind of chastising them as though they're children. These are duly elected state legislators, and you are treating them as though they are criminals almost, wanting to surveil them for 24 hours a day. I think this is a bad look for Republicans, and I think that we have to get back to basics when it comes to the Constitution and what it looks like to do a census that which triggers redistricting.
Well, Adam, let's bring you in here, too, and get your thoughts more broadly on this idea of redistricting, because there are razor-thin margins in the House as we lead up to 2026. How politically charged of an issue is this going to be for both sides of the aisle when you think about how California, for example, is looking into their own redistricting efforts, and that would be at the hands of Democrats?
I think it's really important that we take a step back and remember this all started because the president, in the middle of his decade, unprecedented, decided to call in a political favor to Governor Abbott in Texas to redraw the lines. It's never been done. Now, what California and other states have said, on the condition that Texas takes action, will act. And that is a really important distinction. What's really going on here, though, is that the president is very unpopular. Right? His policies, whether they be tariffs, the big, beautiful bill, are underwater with the voters. And so he's trying to rig the game to make it so that he can pick up seats and save their House majority, because they don't want the accountability for the policies that they put in place. That's what's really going on here. And I think it's important that what Democrats have done is elevate the actions of the president and the Republicans in Texas. It's now a much more national issue, and people are proving and showing that they think it's tremendously unfair and unpopular, and I think it's going to blow back on Republicans in Texas and around the country.
Brittany, in California, Governor Gavin Newsom is trying to rally support in Silicon Valley behind his effort to perhaps pursue a mid-cycle redistricting, and yet we have seen the tech industry and many tech leaders pivot toward Donald Trump. What sort of love might he get for this idea in that area?
Yeah, I'm from California. I'm not a big fan of the governor over there. However, I can understand why maybe some of these tech bros, for lack of a better term, want to be friends with Trump. We've seen him kind of go toe-to-toe with some of the tech industry leaders in the past. And even when we see Mark Zuckerberg, right, when he was there at the inauguration, I think that they've realized that if they want to be able to succeed under the Trump administration, they need to be fairly friendly with him. And if that means sort of going against the governor in this moment, I think that might be what happens.
Well, this is some of the news when it comes to domestic policy, but we also want to make sure to get to foreign policy, which has really been dominating the headlines in recent days. And today, during the White House press briefing, we heard from the press secretary, Caroline Leavitt. She discussed the prospect of a trilateral meeting between President Trump, Putin, and Zelensky. Let's take a listen, and we'll get your reaction on the other side.
The president has spoken to both leaders about this, and both leaders have expressed a willingness to sit down with each other. And so our national security team will help both countries do that. Ultimately, the president has always said that there are areas of disagreement in this war that will have to be discussed and decided upon by these two countries. And so he wants these two countries to engage in direct diplomacy.
Adam, let's get your take here. What is the view when we have the White House trying to show some forward progress here, say that there is going to be some sort of meeting on the books as we wait for more details on what that's actually going to look like?
Look, I think they're trying to save face a little bit. Last week, the president rolled out the red carpet in Alaska for Putin, and he got nothing to show for it. He was talking about a ceasefire for weeks, talked about pressure and tariffs, and I thought Ambassador Volker in the last block laid it out pretty succinctly. Vladimir Putin responds to pressure. Giving him this gift of a meeting in Russia didn't achieve any of the president's objectives, and so they're trying to figure out how they can keep momentum going. If this ends in a ceasefire, if this ends in less killing for the Ukrainian people, that would be fantastic. I think what Ukraine needs are real security guarantees and real commitments that Russia won't take any more territory. They should give back the territory they've already taken. That will, I'm sure, will be part of the negotiation. But I think, bottom line, what the president has tried to secure is a ceasefire, is an end of the killing. And so far, that hasn't held up. And I think that's something that I think the broader public and the administration needs to try to own on.
Brittany, in the 30 seconds or so that we have left, how much political liability is President Donald Trump potentially creating for himself here at home if this effort to secure a peace doesn't end up the way he wants?
I think plenty, and I'll be quick. You know, he said he was going to end the war on day one. It's been 8 months. That hasn't happened. I feel like he often kowtows to Putin and has been somewhat of his lapdog. He criticized Biden for being weak. I think he was, but I also don't think the current president is being very strong against Putin. So I think he's going to have a lot to show for, or not show for, and get some blame there.
All right.
Thank you.
Our political panel tonight, Adam Hodge and Brittany Martinez. We thank you both. A lot of big updates here today, Mike, including what some of these security guarantees could look like. As our own Bloomberg News reporting says that our European allies are starting to work on this idea of getting boots on the ground.
And we want to hear what emerges from these discussions between military officials from the U.S. and the European Union shape up to be, because that will be very consequential for these security guarantees that we've been talking about all week, Tyler.
Right, exactly. We'll be covering it throughout the week. And to learn more about everything you heard tonight, make sure to check out the Washington Edition newsletter on the terminal and online.
Thanks for joining us on Balance of Power. This is Bloomberg. Tyler Kendall and I will be back here tomorrow. We'll see you then.